SAP S4HANA Cloud Knowledge Snippet, and in today's snippet we will be talking about one thing and one thing only, and that is AVC, the hot topic of the moment that is very near and dear to me. The aspect of AVC that we are going to be covering today is going to be a continuation of things that we've already to some extent covered previously, but we're just going to add another level to it, which is about tailoring the UI to something that is really going to fit very snugly to your organization's need in terms of flow when you create a sales order, in terms of logic to it, so that it makes sense for your sales order entry personnel, that when they do configure an AVC sales order, it has a nice flow, it makes sense, they're not jumping back and forth between product aspects of the configuration. And to some extent we've already talked a little bit before about, in previous snippets, about how you can tailor the UI. So we talked about things like characteristic groupings, which allow you to create these tabs to logically group together characteristics that belong together. And the example that I usually take is that you might want to group together the electrical features of your product under one grouping. You might also want to group together the mechanical features of your product in another grouping. The groups also have an impact on the order in which the characteristics are presented to the user. Again, you want this to have a nice flow to it. It has to make sense, and of particular importance here is that it could be that as you progress in the configuration of your product, choices that you make, for example here, are going to have an impact on other characteristics. As an example, it could be that if you are going to be selling this particular product in a country where there is a very high humidity, it could be that later on in the configuration there is another characteristic where you provide an option for a dehumidifier, as an example. So it makes a lot of sense that you order these characteristics in a logical manner. Now, what also makes sense is that potentially you don't want to really perturb a person going through this order by what they see. And what I mean is that it could be that, for example, if a characteristic such as this one is open for input, you want this to be unambiguous. Is it something that the person should enter, has to enter, or in some cases you don't want them to enter it at all because there is no added value, and potentially if you were going to set this particular value, you would end up at the end of the day with a five-legged sheep because it has resulted in a configuration that just does not exist. So what we're going to be talking today about is how you can further enhance the user interface. So this, as I said, is in addition to some of the things that we have covered before. And what we're going to be looking at today is we're going to be looking at a feature which is it's called screen dependency. And before we delve into the details of how it really works, let me show you how you would set that in the characteristics, because this is where it all really starts. And what we are saying is that there are certain characteristics where I want them to be of type no input, i.e. I do not want the person to enter any value. And you can see here we have an example of fire resistant coating where if I click on it, I cannot select the values, and the coloring is light gray, which means that I cannot evaluate this characteristic. Now, as a sales order entry person, for me, it's a no-brainer. It's clear, it's closed for input, so there's nothing that I can put in there. I don't have to worry about it. I'll just move on to the next one. Now, the flip side of that is also true in the sense that it could be that there are some characteristics which at this point in time are open for input, but I want to make them not ready for input because another value was chosen. Now you also have, I should say, several ways of achieving this result. You could use dependencies of type preconditions. So you could check that a precondition is true or not, and as a result of that, make a characteristic open for input or not. Now, it could also be that there are certain characteristics that you might want to make mandatory by using selection conditions. But what we're going to be looking at today is how you can make a characteristic ready or not for input by using a different type of method to achieve that. So as I said, let's go and look at the characteristic first. And now the fire coating characteristic is one that I have got here, and you can see that it's not ready for input. And the reason why this one is not ready for input is very simple, because in the additional data of this characteristic I have specified that it is not ready for input. So number one, it makes sense that it's not ready for input because I've told the system that I do not want it to be ready for input. But as we'll see, it could be that there are certain circumstances where I do want to override that and make it ready for input. So that will be one of the use cases that we will look at in terms of how can I make this characteristic ready for input. I override this setting that I have set in my master data in my characteristic. The other thing I want to show you is how we achieve this. So I have created various reference characteristics. Now the way you call them, it really doesn't matter, but it's of course always useful to have a meaningful description and or characteristic code. But the magic happens in the additional data, and this is a reference characteristic, and it references this table name screen dependency, screen dep, and the field name is input. Now there are two other possible values for the field name, which would be no input and invisible. And as the name indicates, any characteristic that I want to make open for input, then I would need a dependency that says that this characteristic is going to take the name of the characteristic that I want to make open for input. Similarly, if I wanted to make a characteristic not ready for input, then I would pick the reference characteristic that references the field no input. And there is another reserved field name which is invisible, which at the moment with the Fiori UI acts exactly like no input. So the characteristic is not really invisible per se, but it makes it not ready for input. So how do we then leverage these characteristics in our dependencies to have an influence on whether we have certain characteristics that are going to be open or not for input? So for that, and maybe it'll make more sense if we then go to the VC modeling environment. So again, we're looking at the robot. And if I look at the robot, I have a class assigned to it. And you can see that I've got these three characteristics here, which is, I've called them PRE facet input, inv, and no input. And these are my three reference characteristics, which, again, if we look at each one of those individually, and I go to the additional data, so the input one references the table screen dep and field input. The invisible one is that same table and the field invisible. And the last one is screen dep and field no input. And so how do we then use these three reference characteristics in our dependencies? Well, it works a little bit like the variant pricing conditions, in the sense that when you use the pricing, you always have to create a reference characteristic that references the table SDCOM and the pricing condition field. And then in your dependency, you essentially say, okay, I want the reference characteristic pricing condition to have the value XYZ. And for the input, no input, invisible, it works in exactly the same way, except that this time what I'm doing is I'm passing a characteristic name to one of those reference characteristics, so that the system then understands whether the characteristic name I'm passing to it is going to be open for input, invisible, or not ready for input. So let's have a look at a couple of those dependencies that I have added, and I've added those at the configuration profile level. These are two procedures of type AVC, and what I've done here is I've set two dependencies. So my logic here would be that I have one dependency where I would add all the processing needed to determine which characteristics should be not ready for input, and then another one that would determine which are the ones that should be ready for input. Now, this is just an example for the purpose of this recording, but you can of course organize this in one dependency, in several dependencies. It really is up to you. It has to fit with your enterprise architecture, how you want to define those dependencies. So let's go ahead and look at the first dependency, which is to set a characteristic to not ready for input. So I'll just double click on it. I'll go to the editor. Again, some good practice here is to always comment a little bit in an understandable language, so that if somebody else is going to be picking up the work behind you, they can have a little bit of a feel for what's happening without always just looking at the code, even though it is simple enough to be understood quite well. So in this dependency, we're saying that the PC type is not required for input if not programmed via PC. So if we look at what we're talking about here, and what I'll do is I will look at the technical and language dependent description of my characteristics. So I've got these two characteristics here, which is the program type. So how is this robot going to be programmed? And there are two possible values. It's going to be programmed via a PLC or via a PC. And if the customer chooses PC, then I want this characteristic to remain open for input, because he'll then be able to choose the PC type through which he's going to be programming the robot. But if he chooses PLC, then this characteristic is moot. It doesn't apply. So this is essentially what we're doing in this particular dependency here. We're saying that the characteristic PRE facet no input, which is my reference characteristic, which references the table screen dep field no input, is going to take on the name of my characteristic PRE PC type. PRE PC type. So I'm going to set this characteristic to no input if PRE prog is not equal to PC. So I'm going to set this to no input if this characteristic PRE prog is not equal to PC. Or I could also have made it a bit more clearer to say if it, well, no, scratch that, I didn't say anything. Yeah, so we're essentially saying that this should not be offered or should be closed for input if here the person is going to pick PLC. So this is one example of such a dependency. Now let's look at the other one, which is OK for input. Now if you recall, in my characteristic PRE fire coat, so the fire coating, I have in the master data set it as not ready for input. So no matter what dependencies I would have had, by default, when I go into the configuration using this characteristic, the system is just going to shut it down and it's not going to be open for input, which is the case right now. You can see it's saying no, not open for input. But as I said, it could be that there are cases where I do want to override that and I want to make it open for input. And what we're going to do in this particular dependency here, again, I've got a bit of text which says that file code is available in Australia only. So if the delivery plant is going to be 3310 in my sales order, then I want the file coating to be an option that is available. So again, what I've done here in my dependency, I'm saying that the characteristic PRE facet input, which is the one that makes my characteristics open for input, so it references the table screen dep and field input, is going to take on the name of my characteristic PRE fire coat if the delivering plant is 3310. So again, what we're saying here is that it's currently closed, but if the plant that is going to be selected in the sales order is 3310, then I want to make this field open for input. Now already in the testing environment, I can kind of test this. Now, in the sales order, obviously, the person doing the sales order configuration is not going to enter the plant in the configuration. They'll enter this information at the sales order item screen, but I can test this reference characteristic, which is my delivering plant for my sales order, already here in the test tool, so without creating a sales order. So I've entered 3310, and already here you can see that in my reference characteristic group, the characteristic PRE facet input has taken on the name of my characteristic PRE fire coat. And if I now go back to my robot configuration, we should see that the fire coating, as you can see, yep, now here is available as an option. So simply because my sales order is going to be created with the delivering plant 3310, my customer will be given the option to use the fire resistant coating on his robot or not. Now this is in the test tool, so let's get out of that, and what we'll do is we are going to do a quick sales order. Let's go to sales orders, create sales orders, and again we'll do a quick one. OR, we'll put this in 3310 1000. 3010. Okay, so maybe I need to check my dependency, yeah, because that's going to be wrong. It's going to be the delivering plant 3010, not 3310. So there you go. That's how important it is to always test what you do. So 3010. Again, I'm going to quickly pick a customer in Australia, although it doesn't really matter for this particular test. PRE robot 1, and we go to the configuration screen, and you can see that the plant 3010, because this is a reference characteristic, it has automatically been populated in my sales order. I do not need to enter it. And because I picked 3010 as or that was determined to be the delivering plant, the fire coating is automatically open for input. The other thing that I also had that I wanted to test was the program type and the PC combination. And at the moment the PC combination is open for input, so I could pick a PC, but I'm going to go for the option of using a PLC, and as a result you can see that my PC combination is now closed for input. I cannot select a PC. It doesn't make sense. So there you go. This was showing you the possibility of tailoring the UI using the screen dep table in your reference characteristics, which might sometimes work better than doing preconditions, or sometimes you need to use it simply because you have a characteristic defined as not ready for input and you want to make it open for input. So anyway, another cool and great feature that allows you to further tailor the UI whilst doing AVC configurations. Hope you enjoyed it. Till next time. Bye-bye.